Hi, this is Linda Noss, and this is the third video in the concentration video series. So the last time we left, we had a grid drawn that worked out pretty well. And so I thought it might be convenient and a little neater. I'm going to clean up some of this code, and I'm going to put it in a grid class. So we have our button class. I'm going to create a new grid class. So new tab. And I am going to create a class called grid. And as with any class, you need members, you need your constructors, and you need your methods. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, this right here does a lot of my work for me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just grab this code and put it in my constructor, because I think pretty much it's what I want my constructor to do. I want it to create the array. And constructors always start with the name of the class, set of parentheses, and then squiggly brackets. So I'm going to put all this inside of the constructor. Okay, so that's that. And then I'm going to go back over here. I'm going to say, okay, here's my draw method. My draw method draws out the entire grid, so I'm going to grab that and put it in a method called display grid. I am going to paste it right in there and then tab it in so it looks cool. So there's that. So far so good. Now here's the deal. When I create the grid, one of the reasons I want to create a class is so I can make it variable. Right now I'm doing a 4x4 grid. And the grid's going to always start at the same place, because if I set my X, Y, W, and H there, it's always going to be the same place. But what I want to do is I want to be able to create a grid and at the time of creation decide where the grid's going to sit, how big my buttons are going to be. So I'm going to have to change out these concrete numbers with other numbers. So the first thing I'm going to do is I got to create a grid. So I'm going to create a button two-dimensional array. I'm going to call that, I'm just going to use lowercase grid. I'm going to create the number of rows I want. I'm going to create the number of columns I want. And you don't know yet why, but I'm just going to create an X grid coordinate. So that's the only one we're going to need right now. And because I have these different pieces here, I'm going to have to declare them down here. So I want to declare my button two-dimensional array. Same way I did over here in my concentration. So here we are. I'm just going to grab this, copy it out of there, paste it in here. And instead of a 4x4, I've got this rows and this columns. So I'm going to go ahead and put rows and columns in there. So that means I can choose how many rows and columns I want. Now because I'm using rows and columns here, I have to bring it in through the parameter list. So I'm going to create an R and a C that represent rows and columns, and then I'm going to set rows equals to R and C equals to, columns equals C, like that. And that's going to tell me how many rows and columns. So when I create my grid, I actually get to put how many rows and columns. But I also want to be able to put a few other things when I create my grid. I want to tell the computer where my X is going to be, where my Y is going to be, what the width of the buttons are going to be, and what the height of the buttons are going to be. So I'm going to include all that stuff in there. And then because I have an X grid member right here, I'm going to say X grid equals X. So whatever number I pick here is going to come in here. Now we don't really need to use the Y and the W and the H, and I'll show you in a minute why. But right now we do need the X grid. So then I pretty much have my setup. Now I just have to go through and start substituting the correct variables up here for my constants in here. So I got some constants in here I got to take care of. So instead of 4, I want that to be the number of rows I have picked. And instead of 4 here, I want it to be the number of columns I've picked. And by the way, since we're thinking about our for loops, we want this to be exactly the same down here, because we just don't want 4 to print out. We want the number of rows to print out. Down here, we want the number of columns to print out down there, no matter what the size of the grid is. I just hit save, which you should do every once in a while. Okay, so that's pretty good. The other thing I want to do is I want to make sure, I don't always want to go back to 60. Whatever number I choose when I create my grid for my x coordinate, that's what I want to put here. So I'm going to say x, but now I've got x equals x. Mathematically, that's correct, but what I really want to do is I want to change my x grid to start back at the beginning of where my rows all line up. So I'm going to say x grid equals x here. And I'm going to use x grid here and x grid here, because x grid is going to be where each individual button displays. Let's see, I think that's everything. So basically, to review, I have to create a button, a two-dimensional array of buttons, and because I did that, I have to actually use my new right here to create the number of rows and the number of columns I want. The rows and the columns were defined up here in my members, but they were also given a value right here. So now that rows and columns equal something. In order to keep my original value of x, I had to create this x grid variable, and I set it initially equal to the original value of x, but then as I go through my inside loop, the x grid keeps changing. So what I needed to do is I needed to have the original value of x and the updated value of x, and so every time I go around the loop, it updates the x grid value, or the x value of my next button, to move over to the right. But then when I start a new row, I want it to pop back to the beginning of the row. So that's why I need my original value of x. Down here, all we really needed to do was to change our 4s out, our concrete numbers there, and use our rows and our columns. So let's see if this works. Oh, okay, well, it's not giving me any errors, but it's also not printing anything. And the reason it's not printing anything is because I created this wonderful method class, but I never used it. So I'm going to go back into here. I'm going to get rid of all this stuff here. So this really gets cleaned up nice. It's really not a whole lot in here, but I do have to create a grid object. So I'm going to create a grid object. I'm going to call it my grid. And then inside my setup, I'm going to say my grid equals new grid. And then what does the grid constructor say we need to use? We need a row and a column. We need the x and y starting point, and we need the width and the height of each individual button. So I want 4 rows, 4 columns. I'm going to put it at 60, 60 to start with. I'm going to make my buttons 90 by 90. So there's the new grid. So hopefully, let's just run that real quick. Make sure I don't get any error messages. So far so good, no error messages. Now the next thing I want to do is I actually want to make this thing appear on my screen. So I have this display method down here in my grid object called display grid, and I'm going to use that to display my grid. So my grid name is my grid. So my grid dot display grid. And then I'm going to save that, and I'm going to run it, and there we are. Here's my grid. And there it is again. Now let's just say I don't want 4 by 4. Let's say I wanted 6 by 6. And I want to, I don't want very big squares. I only want 10 by 10s. Let's just change that out a little bit. You'll see I got a 6 by 6 and each one is 10 pixels wide. I don't have to have them be square either. I can say, well, I want a 10 by 100. It'll be a little odd looking, but will I be able to fit that? Well, I only have 500 by 500 here. I'm doing 6 times, plus it's not starting till 60, so I think I better increase this to 700 by 700 so it fits on my window. So then I go like this, and there you are. They're 10 wide and 100 tall. So this allows me to create any grid I want of any size and any starting point. So there is my grid object. So this is the end of video 3, and we'll see you back next time.